All right, so welcome everybody to this remote interview. My name is Lisette and I'm interviewing people and companies doing great things remotely. And today on the line, all the way from the Bay Area, California, I've got Jennifer Smith. And Jennifer, you're the CEO and founder at scribehow.com. So you're the CEO and founder at Scribe. It's the world's first operating system for know-how, is what I picked up on the website. So we're going to dive into that in great detail in just a second. But I want to start with the first question, which is, what does your virtual office look like? And what do you need to get your work done?
Thanks so much for having me, Lisette. My virtual office is wherever I happen to physically be. And that comes from lessons I learned at the beginning of my career. I spent 7 years as a management consultant at McKinsey, averaging about 200 days a year on the road. And so that means anywhere that I am with my laptop and my phone is my office. That was often like crammed in the middle seat in the back of an airplane, in a tiny supply closet, at a customer, in my tiny studio apartment when I was getting started, sort of anywhere that I can be. And so for me, that's worked really well, as my workplace has changed so many times, and it just happens to be wherever I have an internet connection and a device that I can talk to people on.
All right, so since the pandemic, I'm assuming you've traveled less, that you're a little more in place. Is it luxurious after having moved around so much?
Maybe I carry my bad habits with me. I have an office in my house. I'm rarely in it. I'm usually switching between all the different rooms just to kind of vary up the environment. But yeah, it's been different for us in COVID. We as a company opened an office in San Francisco 2 months before the pandemic hit, intending to be a San Francisco-based, in-person company. And then obviously the pandemic happened and we had to completely reevaluate.
So before we were starting the recording, you mentioned that in the very beginning, since the company was so small, you rented a house in Hawaii and you were working out of a house in Hawaii. So I'd love to just learn a little bit about that. How was that?
Yeah,
I mean, it's Hawaii, right?
Yeah, the pandemic hit. We were a team of 4 at the time, right? We had just started. It was me and a few engineers kind of, hacking some stuff together and trying to get some quick feedback from the market. And 2 of our engineers happened to say, hey, we really want to go to Hawaii with our significant others. We're just going to go work from there for a little bit. And we said, okay, great. We're not seeing each other anyways because we're in full lockdown. And then they were out there and we said, well, what if we all got together in the same house in Hawaii? What if we just made lemonade out of lemons? And so we rented a place and were able to work together in person and in the midst of the height of the pandemic, which was a ton of fun and just a different way of working.
So how long were you all remote during the pandemic? Because now you're in a hybrid mode.
Yeah, we just, with Omicron, we just officially reopened the office a couple months ago. So we never officially closed the office. We kept it open to folks if they wanted to come. We kind of put testing and other distancing procedures in place, but it was, really quite optional. So we'd only see 1 or 2 people every now and then go in. It's only in the last couple of months where we now have a full office of people back together. And so a lot of the companies that I talked to had to learn how to go remote, having been in person. For us, it's almost the opposite, right? We almost started remote in that we've scaled the team. Almost everyone that we've hired has been during the pandemic. And so we're now figuring out, what does it mean to be a hybrid team? Half our team is within a 2-hour radius of the San Francisco Bay Area. Half the team is not, they're fully remote. And so what does that mean for us is we now have some people who are going back to the office, but we've built this culture of how do we work together async, or at least regardless of where we're physically located.
I love it. So we're going to dive into that. I'd love to hear more about your experiences going back to hybrid for sure. But I want to talk about Scribe first, because a very interesting system. So it says the world's first operating system for know-how, but in your own words, what is Scribe and what does it do?
You have all of this knowledge around how to do your job. Like if you think about what a company or an organization is, or a team, any team, it's a collection of people who have expertise or know-how on how to do a set of processes to get things done, right? And that know-how still mostly lives in those people's heads. And if you want to get it out or share it with someone, you have a few options. You could write it down in a Google Doc and put in screenshots and arrows and annotations trying to explain how to do something, right? I think we can all relate to having done that before. Or maybe if someone asks you a question, you're hopping on a Zoom or you're sending them a Slack or you're writing an email. Those are all incredibly manual ways of explaining something, right? And there's no common standard behind that. And so with Scribe, we said, what if there were a standard? What if there were a way to automatically capture what you know how to do without you having to do any additional work? What if documentation was just digital exhaust? It's just the byproduct of you doing the thing you were planning to do anyways. And so the way that the software works at a really simple level is it's a Chrome extension, or I should say browser extension or desktop application. You click the record button and then you do a process. Let's say you're a salesperson. You add that lead into Salesforce like you normally would. When you're done, you click stop record. What Scribe will do is it'll auto-generate step-by-step written instructions with screenshots showing how do you add a lead into Salesforce. And you have a bunch of options for how you can edit that automatically generated document. But the point is you don't really need to. All the context that someone would need to follow that process themselves is already there. And so that Scribe becomes a way that anytime anyone asks you next time, hey, how do I also add a lead in Salesforce? You're onboarding a new sales team. You change the system that you're working on. You're working with a contractor. You've got a customer who wants to know how to do something, whatever it might be. You now have that automatic documentation that didn't take you any time to create. And now it's a scalable standard. So rather than doing more one-off Zooms and emails and whatever else, you now have a repository, a place where people can go to get answers to these questions. You can think of it as like an automatic hub where know-how lives.
I love that because there are so many things. I mean, I'm constantly making Loom videos and all these things for people, but it doesn't live anywhere. So I want to talk a little bit about the information management there, because we've got all these videos, or you're making all these how-to videos. How do you organize them in a way so that they're findable in the future for people?
Yeah, and Scribe, to be clear, is not a video. We've thought a lot about this, actually. Like Loom and others can be really great for communicating certain kinds of content. If you're trying to convey your company values or how to run a great sales meeting, video is wonderful for that. If you're trying to show someone, like, how do you generate this report in Salesforce? How do I log into my HubSpot? How do I use Zapier to connect this to that? Those are very specific how-to instructions. And so with Scribe, that's a written document with screenshots. It's very visual, it's easy to follow, but that's an important distinction in a couple ways. One, for the person who's communicating that information. I don't know about you, but before I create a video, I stop and think about what I'm going to say, and I want to make sure that I get it right. And if
and I'm looking at my hair and
exactly. And like you're setting up your screen to make sure you don't make a mistake, because it's hard to edit, right? Or if something changes later, then you got to re-record the whole thing. And so we said, like, how do you make it really low friction so that people are just constantly creating these scribes for any process that they're doing? And then for the person following along on the other side, if you're trying to actually do that process, if you're following a video, you're pausing, rewinding, fast forwarding, you can't self-pace. And so we said, okay, what's the best part? It's the fact that it's visual, but let's do it in a format that the viewer on the other side can jump ahead to step 6 if they only need a refresher on this, or they can go much slower if they're trying to sort of figure out their way through it. And so you're exactly right that the problem still becomes, there's 2 pieces to it. One is, like, right now, most know-how is still in people's heads. So if I want to figure out how to do something today, I've got 2 options. I either bug a colleague and say, hey, can you show me how to do this thing again? Or I bumble through it myself and I just try to kind of figure it out. And maybe that goes well and maybe that doesn't, right? Once you then get all of that info out and down, which I would say almost no company has done because it just takes so much time and is so manual to do. But let's say you even did that, right? You put all of your know-how down on paper. Then it becomes difficulty of how do you maintain that over time? How do you make sure that it stays up to date? And how do you make it discoverable and curated for the people who need it at the right time? Right. And so with Scribe, we've thought about that first piece of how do you take that friction down to nearly zero. So people are actually documenting their processes, not out of, the goodness of their heart, taking hours to do it, but as simple as just clicking a record button. And then how do you store that content in a place that people can find it at the moment that they're doing that work in the way that in the format that they need it?
Awesome. So indeed, I was thinking about like all the different like documentation that I've read through, and it gets outdated really quickly. Like anytime the UI in the software changes,
Yeah.
the whole documentation changes. So I'm assuming you just re-record, like you would re-record how to do it, and then the screenshots are all there, everything's updated. And then
Yeah, that's
within
exactly right.
and then within Scribe, then so it's sort of also how-to management in some ways. So you've got a system set up that people can search through and find the different things that they want. And so does every individual company get their own Scribe environment then? Is that how it works?
Yeah, exactly. So you have a workspace and it's exactly what you would expect, right? It's a home where you can collaborate with your teammates or anyone that you've invited to edit and collaborate and comment on scribes together. So if I've got my team space for my sales team as an example, right? Anytime someone has a question on how to do something, they can just type in the search bar and find it or look through the folders as you would imagine. We also think a lot about how to serve that to people at the moment that they have the question. So if you are in web and you go to salesforce.com and you just click the scribe extension, you will see on salesforce.com all of the top scribes from your team for Salesforce appear on that page. So again, trying to even take you out of that, like having to then go search for information, but trying to bring the information into the place where you are, where you're doing work at the moment that you have that question.
Amazing, amazing. I can imagine that this is because documentation has sort of been the bane of many people's existence, right? We've got something good, but then documenting it is like no fun at all. I've written help manuals in previous jobs, and it's no fun at all writing the help
Painful,
manual.
right?
Oh, it's painful to write, it's painful to read. And if you want to reorganize any of it, then you're just reorganizing the whole thing. It's no fun at all. Indeed, I totally didn't like that part of the job.
Yeah, I mean, we see this a lot. Like people will create documentation. It's out of the goodness of their hearts because it takes so much time and it's so painful. And often what we'll hear from them is like, someone had to do this, or I just get asked these questions all the time, And I said, fine, I'm going to take a few hours and just sit down and write it up. And what we're trying to do is say, well, hey, you've already done the hard part. Like, you know how to do something special. You know how to do something valuable and unique. You're an expert. That's the hard part. You should now have software that makes it really easy and automatic to share what you know how to do. That shouldn't be the time consuming part, right? That should be the really easy part.
Yeah, let's let the robots do the boring work and let's do the more interesting stuff. That's sort of what the feeling that I'm getting with this is like, okay, while you're working, the documentation is happening. I like how you described it. You said it's like the exhaust.
Yeah, digital exhaust.
The digital exhaust. I love that. It's a really good term. It's a perfect metaphor. It's like, oh yeah, as you're working, it's getting created. All right. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how your team works now. And so you've gone from being in person for just a couple of months to going all remote and growing the company. You said 10x. You've grown the company quite a lot in the remote time. So I've got some onboarding questions for you. I bet Scribe really helps in the onboarding process as I'm talking through that. So we'll talk about that in a second. But what has been the biggest challenge of going back to the office and sort of going from being all remote to being a hybrid team? What are the challenges that you guys have been facing through this?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. And again, only about half of our team, maybe even a little less, is in San Francisco. So has that option to be in person on any given day. And it's been, the challenges have ranged. It's been everything from the very simple stuff of like, hey, which days are we all coming into the office again? Like, I thought we agreed on Tuesdays. Oh, no, it was Wednesdays instead. Like, when are people kind of clustering together? Because the reason they come to the office is because they want to see colleagues, right? So even figuring out what is that cadence to what does that mean for still maintaining like an equal feeling and equal playing field for the folks who are remote, right? And so the days that we have our team all hands meeting, as an example, are not days that we commonly do in the office together. And part of that is because we want everyone to be on a Zoom screen rather than having half the people together in person and half the people behind on a Zoom screen, right? That creates kind of a different dynamic. And so really thinking through, like, when you do have those in-person interactions, how do you make sure that you're looping in the appropriate people who might not happen to be in the office at that time, right? Even if they live 2 miles away, maybe they're just at home that day. And so how do we make sure that in all meetings that we're having, there's like the same level of collaboration, regardless of where someone is sitting? And so
How
for us,
have
we
you done that?
continue, yeah, we continue to rely on a lot of the same technology and tools that we did when we were fully remote. So we are, not surprisingly, very heavy users of Slack, very heavy users of Zoom. We use Notion for a lot of our kind of internal collaboration as well. And then, of course, not surprisingly, we use Scribe for all of our know-how. And then we've thought a lot about as we've ramped up and hired a lot of people very quickly, like what does that onboarding experience look like? And how do we make sure that people get up to speed really fast? Because the other thing is when you're in a fast growing, startup environment, you need people to ramp very quickly. You can't wait 3-6 months for them to figure out everything that they know how to do. And it's hard to do even when you're in person. I mean, I used to see this a lot. This was part of the, the impetus behind Scribe is, I would see a lot of teams as you got together in person, and someone would always kind of pop their head over to the desk next to them. Maybe they're 3 weeks into the job, 3 months into the job, 3 years into the job. Sometimes, hey, how do I do this thing again? Can you just quickly show me? Okay, thank you. And if you ever pay attention in a physical workplace, that is happening all the time. We almost don't notice it because we just assume it's a cost of doing business when you're together, and you sort of say, oh, that's just, whatever. It was a 2-minute question. But you add those up over time, and that's a lot of disruption in anyone's given day. Now move to a remote environment where you don't even have that option to just quietly tap someone on the shoulder, right? And so what do you see? You see either someone taking the initiative and sending that Slack or that Zoom or whatever, asking someone how to do something. And depending on their personality, that may be a really daunting ask or a very simple ask, right? But it's still like initiating an ask to another colleague. Or they're just sitting there by themselves trying to kind of figure it out on their own, right? And so internally with Scribe, obviously, we've said, if you ever have a question on how to do something, look on Scribe. And if you don't see the answer there, find the answer. And then when you go do the process, obviously create a Scribe for it. And so what we've started to build is a repository that has all of our know-how questions. And we're adding to that all the time, as you can imagine. It's not static, right? Your company and your team and your organization and your processes are constantly changing all the time. And so which ones are most relevant and how they're being used or what's up to date, which ones need to be updated, it's constantly changing as we're working. But it's this mindset shift of anytime I go to do something and we don't have a Scribe for it, let me just make sure I hit that record button because I know that'll be helpful to someone later.
And what about the infrastructure at the office? And I mean like the physical infrastructure, like meeting rooms and things like that. How did that change? Because like you left the office with 4 people, and then you come back with 40-ish, or somewhere around that amount of people. Like, how does that change? And also now some are remote and some are in person. So like, how did you set up your office infrastructure to accommodate for that?
Yeah, it's a great question because we've had to redo the office in the last couple of months as we've come back, and we're now asking ourselves if we should be getting a different space to accommodate needs differently. Because before we had 3 or 4 big open rooms, and everyone worked in a big open room. We kept maybe 1 or 2 of those rooms, everyone's desks were there. Then we kept 1 or 2 rooms open for people to go do kind of breakouts together, right? What we found we needed to do was put in a bunch of, surprisingly, individual call booths, because so many people are now on Zooms with individual teammates elsewhere who are remote. So even if you're in the office, you're talking to your colleague who's in Chicago, right? And if you have everyone doing that on one big open room, it gets really loud.
Yeah.
And so we needed to build a bunch of space. We've put in a bunch of these call booths now. And if you go into our office, you will see it's usually a couple people meeting here, a couple people meeting there, 3 people here with a laptop. So they're Zooming with a few of their colleagues, and then a bunch of people having individual meetings in the call booths around as they're, working with colleagues. And we've tried to build even the muscle, like if we're having an external meeting with someone and we've got 2 people in the office and 1 person remote, and we're talking to a customer, those people who are in the office, rather than co-locating, will go into call booths. So now it's everyone's remote first. Right. So again, this idea of like trying to level like the playing field and the feeling when you're all on a call together.
So why have after having been remote for so long, why have the office? Why not stay remote?
Yeah, it feels a little contrarian, especially in Silicon Valley. I've had so many other founders tell me, hey, Jennifer, I think you're doing a company a disservice by going back to the office. Like, you're going to have a hard time retaining people. You're going to have a hard time attracting people. I've actually found it's been the opposite for us. It could maybe be a bit of bias, the selection bias there. But what we found is people like the option of being able to interact with others at a time of their choosing. And this is true for folks who are based in the Bay Area, and even our remote team members who say, like, I love the city that I live in, and I want to live here, and I want to work at Scribe. I want to work at a Silicon Valley tech company, but I don't want to be physically in Silicon Valley, but I want to come visit. I want to come, a few times a year and spend a bunch of time with my team. And so we just did our first leadership team meeting offsite last week. It's the first time we all got together in person as a leadership team. And because we're all across the United States. And, we were kind of hesitant to do it. We were like, oh, it's a big kind of time investment. People got to fly. Is this really worth it? And, we did it for 2 days. And at the end of the second day, we said, oh, we wish we had 2 more days. We should have done this more, because there was a lot of value that comes from not the conversations that you have when you are deeply brainstorming on a particular topic, but when you're having a beer later. Right. Or
Totally.
when you're having dinner is when you say, oh, hey, I was thinking a little bit more about that thing that you mentioned. Or even aside from the problem solving, like, so much of what you do as a company, like, these people become your family in many ways. And so just getting to know each other outside of a work context, and that kind of like trust building and relationship building that happens is you can take it to the next level when you are in person. And I find that then that translates really well even when you're over Zoom for 95% of your interactions. But if you have that in-person interaction to anchor back to, it just makes a difference in the way that you communicate.
Yeah, I have 2 thoughts on this. One is, I once worked for a team that was all remote, and I was really against us getting in person, because I was like, we're an all remote team, it's going to be fine. And then we got together for a retreat in person, and it changed everything. I mean, one night out of the streets of Lisbon, drinking and dancing together, and we were friends for life, like in a way that did not happen online. And I love working remotely. So I agree. I mean, there's just nothing like getting together and hanging out outside of a work context, I think. For team building on a team. But the other thing that I find so interesting is, it wasn't that long ago that Silicon Valley was saying that startups could not be remote. Like, there was a whole anti-remote sentiment running through Silicon Valley for years and years and years. And so everybody was sort of forced to get together. And now I heard you say at the beginning of that section, like, hey, some Silicon Valley founders are saying, oh, you're doing a disservice by bringing people back to the office. So I find like, wow, has that changed in the last 2 years?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'll take it a step further. I was just catching up with a growth investor who said that one of the things they look for in diligence is this company able to maintain a flexible remote workforce?
Amazing.
Which I'll tell you is the exact opposite. A few years ago, we'd be biased against remote team. We'd say, oh, they couldn't hire in the Bay Area, that's why they went remote, right? And now you look at it and say, oh gosh, it's a bit of a risk if they don't know how to hire remote, because the best talent can live anywhere and could up and move at any time as well. And so, like, they need to have business resilience. And that means having a remote or at least flexible hybrid workforce.
Right.
So,
being able to be remote. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. The world has changed so much in a pretty short amount of time.
Kind of incredible. It's like whoa. I mean, when you said that, I really had this flashback to all the different people I've interviewed in the Bay Area, all the startups that were saying, no, you can't do it remote. You can't do it remote. But okay, no, the world has changed and we have to change with it. That's sort of how it goes.
And I think it's incredibly positive. I mean, what it really comes down to is more choices for everyone.
And more freedom.
Companies
like freedom for companies.
Freedom.
Yeah, exactly.
Individuals have more choices and freedom. You can now divorce the choice of where you live and where you work. That's incredibly powerful. That's never been true in the history of humankind. And now it is. And now it's recognized. And a lot of people were doing it before, right? But they were in the extreme minority. Now it's the norm.
Yeah, before, if you were a digital nomad, it was weird, like you were a hippie or something, and now it's like, oh yeah, I know digital nomads, and there's like co-living spaces and co-working spaces all over the world to support all of this, which is totally great. So I want to talk about onboarding, because you've onboarded a lot of people throughout the pandemic, and a lot of companies are struggling with this. So what were the key things for you in terms of onboarding with remote colleagues? What are some of the things that you set up for Scribe that made that a good process?
Yeah, And we've built out actually like a whole resource on our website around onboarding, because we get asked this question all the time. So for anyone who's interested, like go check out on scribehow.com. We've got a resources section, and there's a whole onboarding module about a bunch of the things that we think about, and also what we've seen as best practices elsewhere for onboarding new folks. We are really intentional about what that process looks like. And every time we go through that process with someone, at the end of it, we ask for feedback so we can improve it for the next person. So we're constantly changing what our onboarding process looks like.
Great idea.
I think you need to do a few things with someone, but I'd say really 3 things when you're onboarding, you have to get right. One is, I think it's really important for people to understand and internalize the vision, mission of the company and the values. And making that explicit up front, and then obviously reinforcing it in every conversation afterwards. And so we actually just went through this exercise as a company. We called it vision to values, where we sort of laid out what's our overall vision all the way down to our strategy and what that means for our culture. And I reiterate that all the time in our company, all hands, in large part because we have a lot of new people joining all the time, right? And so it's always like continuing this drumbeat of like, why are we doing this? Why are we showing up for this? Why is this important? We'll share a lot of snippets of users, like recording videos, like talking about how Scribe impacts them, why they use Scribe, the value they see from it. And so it's anchoring everyone in that why are we showing up? Why is this important? And then it's helping them build and then understanding the work that they're doing and how that ties to our overall why. Right? Okay, we're all showing up to do this. And like, this is the part of the team that you play on and how you help us get to that goal. And here's what that mission looks like. Here are the metrics that we look at to track that progress. Like here's kind of, where you fit in. And then I think there's a big like team building, psychological safety element. So how do you make sure that people get to know the others on the team and the people that they're going to working with really closely and very quickly build psychological safety, this idea that like, I can be vulnerable and open with this person and really candid with my ideas and thoughts. And we're just going to be very intellectually honest with each other and like trying to get to the right answer. And we know that we have each other's backs and are supporting each other through this process. And it's just in pursuit of truth. So a lot of that kind of team building stuff. And then the third thing is like the tactical stuff that you need just to get your job done, right? Like, how do we make sure that you have all of the tools, all of the, the access to all of the systems? We turn that on at 9 a.m. on your first day. So you are like ready to go. You have all of those things. And then obviously with Scribe, using Scribe internally as well, you now have all of that know-how, so you're not bogged down with all of the pesky questions that you have to constantly ask around, how do I do this and how do I do that? And so we've designed that first week and really those first 3 days in particular of onboarding to really anchor around supporting people in those 3 areas. And so some of the tactical things that looks like is like bookending people's days, the first few days, right? Like we have a dedicated person who will check in with them at the beginning of their first day, and at the end of their first day, at the beginning of your second, at the end of the second, just to make sure, hey, are you getting everything that you're needing? Especially if the person's not in the office. Almost everyone that we've onboarded has been remote, right? And so like, I didn't see how your day went. I could see your calendar. I saw that you had all of these meetings, but I don't know. So let's just check in and see, are there any gaps? How are you feeling? What information do you feel like you need? Should we adjust the onboarding process based on, what you're learning or what you're seeing or where you need more help? And I think it just makes someone feel like they've got like a Sherpa through the onboarding process as well, because it can be pretty daunting when you're first getting started and all you see is 50 names in a Slack and you don't know who everyone is and what their personalities are like and if they're going to be friendly when you reach out to them, right?
Yeah, it's daunting to do it in person, and remote I think it's just even more because you're putting yourself out into a place where you're getting no feedback whatsoever, and you don't know people's humor styles, and it can be very daunting. Interesting. So you've bookended it, and it makes me think. I started at a job once, and when I showed up, like they kind of had this desk in the corner, but it hadn't been set up for me. And like, there wasn't even a chair, like somebody had to go find a chair. And I remember like that sinking feeling on the first day of like, oh man, like they didn't even know I was coming. I'm all excited. It's my first day. And then you get there and it's like, oh, so I love that.
I remember working at a startup once and we had like someone show up and no one had any idea who he was or why he was there. And he was like, I'm the new product manager. And everyone was like, what are you talking about?
Oh, that's
and
the
the
worst.
hiring manager had forgotten to mention that the person was coming that day, right? And that they'd even been hired. And I just thought like, gosh, what a terrible, terrible experience for that person, right? This is a really big deal starting a new job is a really big deal. It's a leap of faith. And so you need to do everything as the company and as the team to make sure that you're set up for them and that they have everything they need from day one and feeling empowered. I recently chatted with a C-level person at a very, very large international bank. And he was talking about onboarding and how they're hiring many, many people. And I said, well, how do you think about onboarding? He's like, well, one of our metrics is, to make sure people have access to the tools that they need within their first 3 weeks on the job. And I was like, do you mean that they have all the information that they need and that they're ramped? And he said, no, I mean that they actually have like a laptop and access to all of the tools and systems, like the software that they need in 3 weeks. I was like, isn't that a bad experience for those first 3 weeks that you don't have that? But when you're operating at that scale, like that's the level that they're thinking at, and it's logistically challenging for them.
Wow. Wow. That's a rough onboarding process all around, I would think, if it takes 3 weeks to get your equipment and access to the tools. But okay, I haven't worked at every company. So, so we're nearing the end of the time. I can't believe that went so fast, but I have a couple more questions that I want to ask. And one is around alignment of the team and like making sure that everybody's moving in the same direction. How do you, sort of ensure that people are working in the same way, that you're working on the right things? Have you created some sort of like a team agreement together on how you're going to work? Do you have a company manual? How does that work?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something I think a lot about because it's incredibly important. If you think about everyone on a team, like holding a rope, right? Like in a tug of war or something. And if everyone's not in an exact straight line, even if they're 5 degrees off from each other, you're not going to make any forward progress, right? And so it's a constant exercise, especially as your company gets bigger, or if you're not spending as much time together, of how do you make sure everyone is aligned and we're all rowing and pulling in the exact same direction. And so we spend a lot of our full team time together talking about overall, where are we headed? What are we learning? I talk about startups in particular as being a rapid learning machine. And so how do we make sure that we are sharing back all of the individual learnings that we're getting? And we're 45 people. So we're having 45 sets of daily learnings all the time. How do we make sure that we are synthesizing that info and sharing it back with each other so that I'm learning from what someone else is doing, so I'm not repeating the wheel over here? And so for us, that's an exercise of constantly going back to, why are we here? What is our overall vision? What is our mission? What does that mean for our company strategy? What are the 3 top priorities that we're marching towards right now? How does that actually organize into sets of initiatives? And so we've gone through, it sounds a little heavy-handed, but I think it's really important to do an OKR exercise as a company. And so here are the metrics that we care about overall. Okay, now go into your individual teams and think about what are the metrics you care about at a team level and how does that roll up to the company level? And then go and do a set of individual OKRs and how does that roll up to your team? So everyone within the company can say, here's what I know that I'm responsible for this quarter, and I understand how that moves the overall company forward, in these very specific ways. Right. And we constantly go back and check in and say, okay, a quarter ago, we had said that we were going to do this, or we were testing this hypothesis. We ran this experiment. What is it that we learned? And we spend a lot of our in-person time together sharing back. Okay, I did this. I learned this. That means that we're going to try this differently later. And so that then has trickle effects for what other people are then able to say, oh, okay, I know that teammate learned this. So that means I'm going to do this differently going forward as well. So I think it's constantly aligning on the overall why and not losing that true north of why are we here? Why is this important? Where are we driving towards? And then having kind of rapid iteration and sharing of learnings in the how, the best how to get there.
And how often are you sharing that? Is it like a weekly meeting that you talk about it, or is it quarterly? How often do those conversations happen?
The learnings are daily. And they
Wow.
happen in they happen in different formats. So we've set up Slack channels that are specifically about sharing something that you learned that day. Whether it's an experiment, an A/B test that we ran on our website, or messaging in sales conversations, or feedback from user interviews on products. There are a bunch of different channels and places where everyone's really encouraged and rewarded for, if you just learned an insight, just drop it in a quick Slack, 1-sentence Slack, no big deal, but just a place that everyone can see. And then in our weekly individual team meetings, they are all structured around, what is it that we learned this week? like what worked, what didn't, what does that mean for what we're going to do differently. And then in our overall company meetings every month, we do a review of like, what did we learn this month? So it depends on the forum, but the answer is you want to be doing it as frequently as possible, in a way that doesn't burden people, and then be synthesizing over longer periods of time in the right forums.
Sounds like a really systematic approach. And it reminds me sort of my business coach. We design an experiment every week, and then we do it. We measure the outcome, like, and to compare it to what the hypothesis was. It's like a science, like the old science lab experiments. I feel like it's coming back, like I'm actually using it in real life. But the systematic approach is pretty awesome. And I love the idea of sharing your learnings, because it sounds like you're really developing an experimental mindset where people are free to try things out without feeling like, oh, if it doesn't succeed, I'm gonna fail. But rather you're focused on what did you learn from the experiment, which means there is no failing. I mean, you could fail, but you still learn something. So then it's valuable regardless.
Yeah, we're very explicit about this. There's no failure. The failure is if you do an experiment, but you don't do it well enough, so that if you get bad results, you're not sure if that was the market telling you that was bad or that was just poor execution. That's
Right.
failure, right? But getting an answer, even if it's not the answer that you had hoped for, is still a win, because now you can just check that off your list, cross it off, move on, right? It's high school chemistry applied to software building.
Right. And man, we all thought, well, why are we here way back when? But now, no, I'm kidding. I actually enjoyed my chemistry classes, I have to admit. Okay, so last question, or last two questions that are easy ones, which is if somebody's starting out, like, they've heard about Scribe now, like what advice would you give for people who are trying to document, all of their different procedures? How would you start?
Yeah, so, I mean, my answer would be use Scribe, but it's not the self-serving answer. The reason there is so few of a company's processes are actually documented right now, and it's because it takes so much time to do. We see the pain on people's faces when they have documented before, and I would estimate that nearly every company has less than 1% of the actual processes that they do written down on paper in a way that is up to date and accurate, right? And so the first thing to do is just when you're going to do a process and you think someone somewhere, whether that's a client or a customer or a teammate, is going to have to do that same process at some point, just hit the record button, just create the Scribe for it, right? And you're doing that in a way that like makes it easier for them, obviously, but is also going to save you time, because next time someone asks you that question, you can just point them to Scribe, right? Rather than having to hop on that Zoom or send that email.
And all of us really want to decrease the number of online meetings that we're having. And this is a great example of something that you can take asynchronous and then not have that synchronous meeting. So that opens up time for everybody in terms of that. And then the last
I love that
question.
you said that. There's so much research on collaboration overload. And I talk a lot about this in the pandemic of, I've said, we use so much Zoom and so much Slack, and all these tools are incredibly wonderful, but you can spend most of your day, there's a bunch of research about how this is increased, especially for remote workers, just communicating with other people. And you can feel like I had a really busy day, but you didn't actually produce any output, right? You just spent the day talking to people, which can be fun, but doesn't always move the ball forward, right? And so we think a lot about how do you reserve that in-person time or even that async one-on-one communication within Slack or email for those things you really have to problem solve together. And for things that are just reference questions, how do you push that to be async and in a one-to-many way, potentially? So it's not one-off questions here and there, but it's here's a reference that you and 5 other people can go look at. So where are you getting these leverage points on your time?
Brilliant. Because Zoom fatigue is a real thing, or whatever meeting tool thing is a real thing. And I think also the context switching going between your inboxes and trying to do deep work and like going back and forth, it's just exhausting. And clearly what we saw during the pandemic was productivity was not the issue. It was burnout that was the issue. And it's just people working more and all the context switching. So I love anything that will take down that context switching and free up people's days for just more deep focused work, because most of us are knowledge workers that are listening to this podcast or in this field, and we need time for thinking and processing information. So yeah, communication and collaboration overload is a real issue that I think is not getting enough attention, but will because it's not a sustainable way of working. It's just not a
Well,
sustainable.
it seems so innocuous at the time, right? The quick Slack ping that you see appear on your screen where someone says, hey, can you quickly just tell me how to do this? Where can I find this again? Right? You say, oh, that's no big deal. That takes me a minute to respond to, but it probably costs you about 3 or 4 minutes in terms of actual productivity when you think about the disruption from your flow, the context switching, and then trying to switch back to where you were before. And there's a lot of psychological research around the value of flow and the cost of when you break people out of it. And it seems small, but it's actually quite big.
Well, and as the company grows, I can imagine it just gets exponentially more and more. Well, Jennifer, I've taken so much of your time. I'm really appreciating that you're here. So I will put a link to scribehow.com in the show notes. But if people want to get in touch with you, what is the best place, or where is the best place to find you on the internet?
You can check me out on LinkedIn or Twitter. I'm at Scribe CEO. LinkedIn is Jennifer Smith, and feel free to reach out. You also feel free to try the product. It's free. If you go to scribehow.com, you just click that sign up button. It takes less than 4 minutes from the moment you click sign up to the moment that you're able to create and share your first Scribe. We've actually clocked this. So it's really, really easy and fast to get going. I think it would be a bit contradictory if we were a productivity tool where that wasn't true, but you would be surprised. So feel free to check it out and try it out.
Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, everybody, until next time, be powerful.